mindful of the book of 1 Timothy. We're mindful of the things that have been done and that we'll be learning today. We ask that you'll help us to make application where it's necessary. And it is always necessary. Father, forgive us of our sins. Help us to uplift one another with the words that we have to say to each other. And be an example to those outside the world, in the world, Father, in Christ's name.
Amen. Very good. So we have been studying in 1 Timothy chapter 5 about instruction on how we are to treat one another. The past few weeks we looked at how we are to treat each other, like if you're dealing with somebody older than you, like a person, a gentleman older than you, you're supposed to treat him like a father. If it's older than you, it's a woman, treat her like a mother, like a sister if it's equal age or brother. So those dynamics in the church are very important, as obviously treating each other right is essential of being part of a functioning church, that there's love and care for one another in the church. And then in verses 9 through 16, it zooms in a bit on the widows that sometimes are in the local church. And we've been talking about this actually even earlier in the section about how we're supposed to treat one another. And generally speaking, the church has a responsibility towards widows in a certain way, but then there are certain widows that the church has an additional responsibility towards. And that's what we're going to expand on it today. So let us please read this section. I believe we read it last week, but we left it here. So verses 9 through 16. If I can have a couple of volunteers to read this, please. Who wants to read first? Jeff, go ahead, sir.
Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has watched the saints meet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work, but refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith.
Very good. And 13 through 16, somebody else? Lisa?
And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, and manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after saying, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are grieving.
So it talks here about some widows that are really widows. So honor true widows or really widows. So obviously in the New Testament church back 2,000 years ago, and even in our day and age, the widows are an important concern of the church. Oftentimes we come and go as we are a part of a church, but oftentimes we don't give a lot of thought to a person that may be widow, because being a widow, a person can have special needs, right, that the church should be aware, and the church should make every attempt to help that person. As being a widow, it's certainly it's being not having anybody, not just being a widow, but not having a family, not having somebody close to you to really support you. It can be very hard. I mean, sometimes it's hard if you're a widow, even if you have family around, right? Especially if you don't, if you are alone. We defined last week what it means to be a widow. Anybody remember what it means to be a widow? What is the definition of the word widow? Alone, right? When you're alone, you're a widow. So that's really what it means, the definition. So we looked about the church in Jerusalem, about the fact that they were confronting this issue with having widows. We saw in James chapter 1:27 how pure and undefiled religion, part of it is taking care of the widow and visiting widows and being aware of widows. So yet, however, is not a responsibility simply to be cast upon the church, because the local church certainly has responsibilities. So if the widow does have family, children, and so forth, it's their obligations However, if there are any widows that don't have any family whatsoever, then it becomes the responsibility of the church. So, just like we have qualification for elders and deacons, there's also qualification for widows. Verse 9 says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number." That means don't let a person under 60 be considered on the roster of being provided by the church as a widow. So age matters. So obviously, as he mentioned here, the issue is, as we talked about, women, widows that don't have any other means of, the family is not there, right? So I believe we touched on this last week. The church can help any Christian widow, right? I mean, however, this chapter talks about a permanent and ongoing support. So at some point or another, there may be a widow that needs help, and we can provide that help kind of on an individual basis or even from the contribution. However, this section, it's a very important distinction because it's talking about widows that become the permanent responsibility of the church. And imagine if somebody's 61 years old, that person can live for another 20, 30 years. And guess what? 20, 30 years, that becomes the responsibility of the church. Members may come and go, but the church remains with that responsibility of really assisting and taking care of this widow. So, in essence, the congregation, the church, would support them until they die. And as I mentioned, it could be a long, long time. Lisa?
I don't think, well, I wanted to ask actually. It's not just the widows in your own congregation either, necessarily, because just for example, and I actually found it very interesting, that there was a church in Texas, for example, that, where Hazel used to go.
Yeah.
And that church was sending Hazel a check every single month and did from the time that her husband died, and her husband died when she was here. So she had been a member there in the past. And when her husband died, that church in Texas started sending her ongoing support. Wasn't a lot, but every single month it was something that she could count on, and there were times when she really needed that. So it's not just necessarily for people in your own congregation, but obviously that was a bigger group, and they had heard that her husband died, and for years they were sending that to her. So, I think sometimes we need to think outside of just our little, 30 people.
Yeah. So, right.
We can help other people that may not necessarily be here,
Right, right. So obviously, the waters are a little bit more murky when it comes to the responsibility of the local church to support for widows in other churches, right? I mean, that's something that we can discuss, because if that's a responsibility, where do you stop, right? I mean, is the responsibility of every church to assist the needs for every widow in every? So, but
I'm certainly not saying that.
right.
That on the check that she would receive,
Right.
widow support.
Right. So obviously, a church, any church within the confines of the scriptures, they could choose to support a certain widow, I guess. Certainly, they must have had a strong relationship with Hazel, and Hazel, just the kind of person that she was. I mean, she's very, the way she was. I'm not surprised that even another church would decide to support her for the rest of her life that way, even if it's $100. But that's a good point. So obviously, I certainly, we wouldn't take that as a foundation for authority that we ought to support widows in other churches besides our church. However, the scripture here pertains to the fact that the immediate responsibility that the church has is for the widows that are in the same congregation with the widow. Makes sense.
I think that keeps within the autonomy of the congregation.
Right.
Too. Yeah.
Right, and it's a very, I mean, the fact that that congregation was supporting Hazel, I mean, that has nothing to do with the church here, right? It's not like we can get upset, oh, why are you supporting that? That's our job. Nobody got upset.
There's also sometimes when churches like who have larger amounts of money, they help to support another preacher.
Right. There you go.
That same
Right.
day.
That's very similar, yes. Good point. Good point. So we're talking about definitive qualifications that exist. As I mentioned, 60 years of age must be minimum age. Taking to the number means to really capture it on a list of the widows. Obviously, back then, it was very typical for there to be widows. And unlike our wonderful country where there's so many government programs, and in this country is very hard, right, Tracy, to really have zero support from anybody, to be totally destitute, because there are government programs in place, right? You would have, I remember in the last few months when Hazel was alive, we had Meals on Wheels, right? And that is free, right?
No.
Meals on Wheels?
I think there's a fee for that.
Like Hazel would pay?
Well, it's very minimal.
It's very minimal, but if she didn't have any money,
There may be, I don't want to say for sure.
yeah,
It's some people are free. My next door neighbor is free. My dad was $2.16 a week or something.
A
It was
week.
like nothing. It was
Yeah,
peanuts,
yeah.
So, and he still has it even to this day.
yeah.
So, yeah. So I think it depends on your income.
Yeah, depends on the income, and obviously, depends on. But I don't want to drag this too much. So, bottom line is that in this country, we have a lot of systems in place to really provide for the widows, for people that don't have any support. But back then, you didn't have these systems in place, and therefore, if those widows didn't have Meals on Wheels, wasn't available back then. Brad?
I know that if you were lame, they would set you out in front of the gate to be given, help, money, or whatever it was. But was there anything for the widows, or was that only for the lame, like those who couldn't physically work? Because we know that the poor went out to take care of the fields, but they weren't allowed to
Glean.
do the
Right.
choirs. They couldn't go
Right,
twice.
right.
It was for the poor.
Right.
But I don't know if that included widows, or if they would be put out by the gates with the lame, or if this was because there was nothing for
Yeah.
them, so that's why they had to be taken care of.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm glad that God ordained it the way He did. I mean, it would be terrible to say, okay, take the poor widow and put her somewhere to beg, at the temple. That would not be a very, that would be a pretty cruel thing to do. And why, when the church can support them, right? I mean, and not just the church, like from the contribution, but we are to be taking care of each other, right? I mean, if somebody's in need, what are you supposed to say? Well, go outside and beg somewhere, or we are to help each other. If you don't have food, I'm supposed to say, come over. I'll share my food with you and just help that person. Yes, sir.
I just think that support back then and support now are totally different. I mean, not totally different, but there's
Yeah.
a different aspect of it. And help would be making sure that Hazel has all the wheels on.
Right.
wheels
Right.
And helping her support that
Yeah.
she's getting.
Yes.
She's
True. Different kind of need. But even there, that you bring up a good point. But even that, it still help. Whatever. Let's say it's time that you have to pause and take her on a Monday morning on a doctor's appointment for all morning. So regardless what it is, they do need help, right? It's hard. I mean, at the end, Hazel could not drive. I mean, she could not put the key in the ignition. It was very hard for her, and obviously, it was difficult. But sir.
I just want to add, like with speaking on that subject, like Matthew 6:25, where it tells us to not worry about food or clothing; it will be provided. So if we're not focused on ourselves and we're allowing God to work through us,
Yeah.
if God's plan is being activated when He's caring
Yeah.
for His,
Yeah.
His own.
Mhm.
But if we hinder that, we become focused on ourselves and our own selfish
Mm-hmm.
needs, then that's where
Yeah.
and letting God, plan to fall in place, which is what we're talking about here with widows.
Yeah.
We're helping, God's taking care of the widows through
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And we should not hinder that. But
Yeah.
Matthew 6:25, I like that where it says, "Do not worry about it." So
Yeah.
us
The
following
Father knows that you have those needs, indeed.
and He'll
Yeah.
provide through us.
Yeah, and as far as we are concerned, helping others is like, oh, I can't because then I don't have food for myself. Come on, we're trust in the Lord that He will provide.
Well, after those verses, he's in 33. He says, "Seek
Yeah.
first
The kingdom of
kingdom
God,
and
yes.
all these things will be added to you."
Yeah.
Necessities of life.
Yeah,
So there's the other part to it in the context.
yeah,
If we're seeking first,
yeah,
then we're going to be taken care of.
Yeah.
But if we're not seeking, just like he talks about,
Yeah.
man shall not work.
yeah. Neither should not eat.
He's not going to
Yeah,
have any
mhm.
munchies.
Yeah,
So it's not going to work. So there's both parts to it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Don, you had tuned up, sir?
No.
Okay. Very good. So 60 years old, wife of one man. That really means faithful and true to her husband as long as they both live together, right? I'm not going to read those passages, but that's what it means. So well reported for good works. So her reputation is that of a life of what a Christian woman should be, right? It reminds me again of Hazel and certainly Gloria and many other ladies that we know that they are leaving behind such a legacy in terms of faithfulness and really showing a path, of being faithful in their life and through everything that they did. So well reported for good works. Well reported for good works. And then that she has brought up children. Really, that means that she brought them up in the instruction of the Lord. Next, that she has lodged strangers. We touched on this last week a bit. Hospitality is demanded. This is a requirement, by the way, of every Christian, not just of widows. Yes, ma'am.
At the end of verse 9, it says, "And not unless she has been the wife of one man."
Yes.
And you mentioned that means faithful to one man, like not being married twice, or is that different than what the phrase that they use to describe qualifications for an elder?
I believe they are, yes.
They're the same word?
Well, obviously, I believe they're applicable in both instances. So, to answer your question, what if the woman had a husband and died when she was in her 30s, and then she married another person, and she was with that man for another 35 years? Does that mean she doesn't qualify because she had two husbands? Okay. Just the same with the man. The qualification.
What is the answer then? I mean,
So
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
So the answer, the best answer that I have, just like with the elder, needs to be the husband of one wife. That is a one woman man, right? That is the man that only has one woman, right? That means it could be at a time, I guess, if the previous woman dies, and the same thing with a woman. If the husband dies and she marries another, still one man, right?
I mean, that's how I see it. I wasn't sure where you're
Yeah.
going, and I understand it to be that.
Does that make sense? Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, I just want to know
Yeah.
if they would like the same word or the same, same root word or same.
Yes, I would say that is the same principle, yes. And keep in mind, we just the chapter earlier, we talked about the qualification of elders, and is the same principle, right?
Okay.
That means, really what it means is that if you are a loose woman, right, all of your life, and you bounce from man to man like that, it reminds me a little bit, I have a great respect for that woman, the Samaritan woman, right? How many husbands she had? 5, I think. 5. And the one she had now, it wasn't hers. Well, she didn't quite qualify because she wasn't really a one-man woman, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's a good example. But again, if your husband passes away and you marry again, that still qualifies you as a really wife of one husband. Lisa?
And it says, if you're under 60, get married. So, it's encouraging women under 60 to get married again.
Yeah.
But not saying that, if her second husband dies, that she wouldn't be
Right. Of course not.
So, I mean, back then, there was a reason. He said, women under 60, you need to be busy. You need to be busy with kids, with husband, with household, with family, because otherwise it can lead to sin.
Yeah.
So, but after that, you're older, you know, you shouldn't need to have, a husband necessarily in order to find support. Because back then, you know, support was hard for a single woman.
Yeah.
Sometimes impossible. So marriage was really a social, you know, it was social security in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. So we're talking here about lodging strangers and being given to hospitality. Again, hospitality does not come very easy because hospitality is work, right? Would you say? I mean, if you know you have people over, it takes a lot more effort on your part. You need to just kind of keep the house clean. Reminds me of Lisa last night. She was still up till 3 o'clock in the morning. Clean the house, like, honey, the house is clean. Go to bed. Oh, it's not clean. I still have to clean it. And then the cherry on the top is when she went in the garage and opened up a can of paint. Paint, because there's some scuffs on the walls.
You know what,
And then
we'll
she
be the
paint.
judge of that this afternoon.
And then she's got, because you know, she said, I can't have Jim come to my house.
That's right.
And then she will point out all these scuffs on the wall. But when you come home this afternoon to my house for the potluck, there'll be no scuffs on the wall.
And everybody gets a black glove.
Until we leave.
Yes. What? It's true. No, it's fine. They'll see it. The walls look clean. We're good. No problem. Yes.
She lost her big helper to Florida.
She did, but she has another one right next to her. Helper number 1 and helper number 2. So they're all right. She's okay. Okie dokie. So let's continue. So lodging strangers, and again, I mentioned here about hospitality because this is something that every Christian should have, and every Christian should seek to be entertaining others and strangers. Just the same way that we are to love one another, to really be nice to one another, to all the other laws of God that we abide. You see this trend throughout as a good work among Christians that they are to show hospitality. And I have several passages there. I'm not going to go through for the sake of time, but so lodge strangers. The next one is that she washed the saints' feet. So this is just a mark of Oriental hospitality bestowed on a stranger arriving from a journey. Well, obviously, it's very different in our day and age because nowadays people don't walk for miles and miles and come home with feet all dirty and right. But think about it. I don't think this is some kind of figure of speech here. It looks like this was some kind of practice that you go to someone's house and say, "Oh, sit down. I'm gonna get some water and I'll wash your feet."
Or when someone comes to your house now, you offer them something to drink.
Yes. Yeah, but something to drink, it's easier than say, "Come over here, let me just scrub you, give you a pedicure." It's very different, right? Yeah.
I'm not sure what would relate to that in today's world. We're so lucky to have so many things. I'm not sure what would even be to that level.
I don't know. What I'm thinking of, let's say you, I don't know. It's very hard something to compare to that.
Well, I think it was a custom of the time. I mean, that's
Yeah.
all there was. I mean, could it apply today? Oh, yeah. Maybe it applies in a different way. As she said, maybe a cup of water. Maybe it's just not that anymore, you know?
Yeah.
I don't even know if that happens. Maybe it does happen in some other
Mhm.
areas, even to this day.
Yeah.
My feet are looking forward to getting over to their house.
No problem. We have a dog at home. She likes to lick people's feet. That's as much as you're gonna get. But hey, so obviously this was something back then. It was something that people would do. Yes. Yeah.
But it's different everywhere you go.
Well,
you know?
you're serving others. I mean, you're supposed to serve others. So that's,
Right.
I guess, in different cultures.
Right, right, right.
Different ways of serving.
Right. Right. John?
I remember back in the days visiting relatives, you know, we were all excited to see each other and hugs and kisses and everything. And then they would feed us.
Mm-hmm.
Remember one time I went to visit my grandfather at his ranch, and he gave us an entire, he loaded up the trunk,
Mm-hmm.
nothing but watermelons.
Nice.
And if you remember the trunks back in the days, those vehicles, you know, they were humongous, you put about 20 bodies in there.
Right.
Right?
So obviously, it is a cultural to some extent. However, if we constantly look, even in this day and age, even in this culture, sometimes you can think of people that when you go to their house, they kind of go out of their way a little bit, as opposed to kind of like, you're here, okay, and you're kind of like, okay, when are you leaving, kind of thing. So even in this, it's that spirit of really welcoming that person and making sure that person is comfortable, that they feel like they are at home, right? Make yourself like you're at home, kind of, right, thing. So, but it is, I will tell you, it is, and it can be expressed in a different way. It can be expressed in a different way in our day and age. Yes, ma'am?
I was thinking another example is like the holy kiss. That was a Grecian.
Yes.
and,
Yes.
Roman
Right.
where they did probably kiss on the cheek, but we don't do that now.
Yeah.
We do handshake or hug.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But it can be manifested in many, many ways, many ways. And we always should look for ways that we show that kind of affection, right, that we give to others. Yes, ma'am.
I think the whole concept of washing the feet is that was what they needed the most.
Yeah.
You know, by the way, from the way they traveled, that was what they needed the most when they arrived,
Mhm.
wherever they were.
Yeah.
So in, today's,
Mhm.
travel, like
Yeah.
you said, it would be to offer them something to eat or something to drink.
Yeah.
That's what they most need.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. Very good. So, wash the saints' feet. Somebody else, did you have something to say, sir? Go ahead.
I was just gonna read the commentary from Barnes. He says that in this section, it is debated whether it's a literal translation or more of a figurative translation. And literally, that's what they did during the time. But we can take it as it's showing that they're humbling themselves and denying the self, because in that culture, the feet is the
Lowest.
part
Yeah.
of the body. It's all the way at the bottom. It's the dirtiest part. So to humble yourself to be even lower than someone else's feet, to clean their feet, is to put yourself
Right.
at the very bottom.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And as Christians, we're supposed to humble
Yeah.
ourselves, because
Right.
it's within a section of the scriptures where it's talking about hospitality.
Yeah.
So it's lodging others, taking care of the afflicted, washing the feet. It's all about humbling yourself, doing good deeds
Yeah.
for others, and it's not about look at me and look at what I'm doing.
Yeah.
It's let me take care of you.
Yeah.
And that's
It's true. It's true. So washing the saint, we should all, as we moving on from here, we should all seek to wash each other's feet. And Jesus gave us this example, right? I mean, he washed the feet of the disciples, and not that we ought to wash each other's feet physically. Some people in cultures are still doing, some religions are still doing it. But we can wash each other's feet in many ways that are beyond just the physical washing. Nowadays, some people do it as a symbolic. I mean, nobody needs to have anybody's feet washed, right? I mean, most of you probably took a shower and your feet are already very clean.
Today they don't have to have their feet.
No, correct.
But in
Yes.
the olden days, when
They
they had
did.
to walk
Mhm.
so far from
course.
one place to another, it was very restful.
Absolutely.
Their feet really needed to be
Right.
dusted and
Right.
got
Right.
those sandals
Right.
off.
Right. Absolutely. And it is even in nowadays. I mean, when you go home after a long day and your dogs are barking, if you put them in some warm water with some Epsom salt, it will feel good, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Olive oil.
Olive oil. That's a lot of olive oil.
Warm water with olive
that works. I mean, just any kind of warm water. I mean, okay, so we understand. Obviously, giving a little bit of love to your feet goes a long way. Your feet will be thankful. So, next one is that she has relieved the afflicted. This indicates a sympathizing spirit and one who is ever ready to relieve those in distress. This is kind of another qualification of these women. Relieve the afflicted. Obviously, throughout one's life, there are always opportunities, if you're looking, not too hard necessarily, to find people that need help, that are afflicted, and you just alleviate that affliction. Next one is that if she has diligently followed in every good work. So this extends to the list of good works already specified as other opportunity affords. So it talks about really being constantly having a mind of just seeking to do good for others, having a good reputation of doing so. And then in verse 11 it says, but refuse the younger widow. Those under 60 are to be excluded. And he talks about them desiring, if they're young, that they would want to have a husband and so forth. And Lisa mentioned if they are less than 60, they should actually get married. And obviously when somebody's married, their needs and their, to a large extent, they would be connected with their husband. And it's a different mindset that if the person is over 60 and their mind is now completely on God. So also it continues here and it says that if they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. So doesn't mean that marriage is wrong, but to grow wanton against Christ and to cast off their first faith would be wrong, and this would bring condemnation. So this means pretty much if your mind now it's all on the flesh and all carnal, and you're no longer on Christ, obviously there's a contrast there. And also we touched on this, that if they don't get married, right, if they're young, it's very easy to become idle, right? And the suggestion here is that if you are younger than 60, the person should get married. So such permanent support at such young age can lead to idleness, which could be a great curse. So unfortunately, we see this even in our society with people that are getting support from the government at a very early age, and then guess what? They don't have to work anymore. It's just crazy that somebody can just rely on the government and they could just say, I don't need to work anymore. And Scripture, what it says that you should work, right? Not expect that others should provide for you, especially if you are able-bodied, right? If you can't. Like, if you can't, that's one thing, understandable, but there's many in our culture that they seek to take advantage and to just get free stuff so they don't have to keep a job and work like everybody else. So, again, the point here is that if the church would support this person and then this person didn't have to work anymore, I mean, this woman would say, well, I don't need to do anything anymore. I'm just going to be around and do nothing all day. And then doing what? It even goes on into saying what are some of the things that this idleness will lead to. This person, young widow, would go from house to house and not only idle, but also gossip and busybody, saying things they ought not. I like how he puts it here. Busybody and just saying things that they ought not. In other words, just you talk. Just don't talk. And not everything has to be said, right? Just keep it to yourself. And who does this? People that have a lot of time on their hands. If you're very busy and if you have a job, 2 jobs, you work like crazy 10 hours a day, right? I'm thinking about a lot of people in this congregation that work a lot. I'm thinking of Jim, I'm thinking of Barrett, many other people. you don't have time to go from house to house and talking about other people's business, right, Jim? I was last time you went to somebody's house and say, hey, by the way, did you hear so and so?
This afternoon.
Very good. We'll talk later. Yes. So gossiping and meddling are practices certainly condemned in scriptures. Meddling is just minding other people's business. It's just mind your own business. I mean, oftentimes somebody comes to me and talks about this person and this person. I just, in my mind is okay. Try to remove yourself from this person's presence as fast as you can. Bless them with your absence. Just remove yourself from their presence. And then they'll go somebody else, right? But at least I'm not involved. And because sometimes it's hard, really, to tell this person, hey, you're supposed to stop talking, you know? Sometimes that works because they don't come to you anymore, but it just makes for a very awkward conversation.
Just read the scripture too.
Yes, just says, can we turn please to 1 Timothy chapter 5? But they'll say I'm not a widow because it doesn't have to be a widow. Very good. I think we understand. So therefore, I desire, it talks about what the plan should be, that if the person is a younger widow, that they should marry, bear children, yes, even. So to bear children also implies that you're going to train them as well, manage the house, to direct the household affairs, be keepers at home. And yes, as much as women back then, and even to some extent, not to the same extent nowadays, it's best if they have a partner, right? That if they're married, not just from economical, but also for emotional support and all of that. I mean, it's hard for the men too to be alone. You know, just the same way God designed for men and women not to be alone, right? To be together. So as much as it is certainly very helpful to the woman to have a husband, it's very helpful to the men to have a wife, because man comes home after a long day of work. It's certainly super, super cool to say, honey, there's food for you, waiting for you, and the house doesn't look like a pigsty. I mean, it's kind of nice. I mean, because imagine you come home and then your house, right? I'm picking on somebody closest to me. You come home and the house is like a tornado, and you say, honey, what is there to eat? You say, well, I don't have any food for you. You have to go get you some fast food or something. Or, you know, the house looks like a grenade exploded in the middle of the living room. It's a win-win, right? It's a win-win. And as much as they say that, oh, you don't work. Yeah, I work. I'm at home. And that's a lot of work. Sometimes I'm glad, right? Men are happy to be away because at work never ends. Seems like. But anyways, manage the home, bear children, and then it says, give no opportunity to adversary to speak reproachfully. So Paul was certainly concerned about the enemies of the truth, what they would say about the church. And obviously it's not flattering to the church to have people going around from house to house, gossiping and all that. So, but when the person has nothing else to do, you certainly give the adversary a reason to talk about you that maybe they're right. If you don't have nothing to do, what are you going to do? It's just, what do they say, that idle hands are devil's workshop? Yes. Or idle mind? Yes. Yes, very good. And then in 1 Timothy chapter 5, let's read please verse 15 and 16 again. Who wants to read this? 15 and 16. Go ahead, sir.
For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows.
Very good. So just repeat this section here. So as I believe this is my last slide for today, actually 2 more slides. Obviously, as we're wrapping up this section, we need to understand that failure to respect one another in the context of what we cover so far in 1 Timothy chapter 5, failure to respect one another, failure to exhort one another, failure to honor and support one another, failure to fulfill one's individual obligation, especially even as it relates to our responsibility towards widows, it is a failure to respect and honor Christ. I mean, if we don't respect you, if I don't exhort, if I don't honor, if I don't take care of a widow that God says that I should, visiting the widows and so forth, and if I don't do that, obviously if I don't do what God asked me to do, I would not be honoring God. I would not be honoring Christ. Does that make sense? Very good. And I have last passage, last scripture. I have an example here. 3 minutes left. We're just going to spend a little bit about this woman, Tabitha, as we're wrapping up this study on talking about widows. Who wants to read this section? Verses 36 to 41. Bradley?
At Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. But it happened in those days that she became sick and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. And since Lydia was near Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room. And all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas has made while she was with them. But Peter put them all out, and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. Then he gave her his hand and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her
to them. So, isn't this amazing? So here you have a woman called Tabitha, and you can see, what she was doing for other people. People gather to really to be there to support. It doesn't say if she has family or whatnot, but everybody gathered at her funeral, or when she died. And then she said, look what she did for me. Look what she made for me. Look what she did. And he mentioned here, she was so full of good works and charitable deeds. So, yes, sir.
Her punishment was coming back. Good deeds. Thanks.
Well, right, but to some extent, obviously she died again, I'm sure later on. But I mean, what happens to her? It was obviously boosted everybody's faith, I'm sure, and everybody loved to have her. It's not like just anybody died. It was this person that, and we can understand that possible that she was not quite at her age to die. I don't think Peter would have brought her back to life if she was 102 years old. Likely she was still in power, so maybe she didn't die of natural causes. Maybe she was sick of some sorts, but I wanted to give this woman as an example as how, and not just, I'm not putting women on the spot, because I think every Christian should seek to do good unto others and to do charitable works, just like this lady Tabitha, and do for others and think about others. So I would like to end with this. It's 10:45. We'll continue next week with the next section. Let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 11 for worship. Thank you.